Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Voter Registration and Engagement for the Healthcare for the Homeless Community. This webinar is produced by the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. First, I'll go over some housekeeping. This is a 60-minute presentation and there will be about 10 minutes at the end for question and answer. As you can see, there is a chat box below the presentation slides. You can type in questions there for us to answer at the end. You can type those in at any time. If you're having technical issues, you can also type them there. Please feel free to use this throughout the presentation. We will do our best to get to all the questions. If you're having technical questions, aside from putting them in this chat box, you can call our office line and speak to Cecilia at 615-226-2292, extension 241. A recording of this webinar will be up on our website within 3 business days, and we will also be emailing this out to everybody who's registered. And as you can see, there is a resource box on the bottom right below the presentation slide, and there is a PDF document in there that is voter registration resources. We will be referencing those and talking about them throughout the presentation, so you can open that up and download it and save it for yourself for your use while you're on this webinar and for after. So all right, my name is Regina Reed, and I am the policy organizer at the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. I will be moderating this webinar and also presenting, and I'm really grateful to be joined by 2 great speakers and experts on this very topic. One is Joseph Benson. Joseph is a board member at the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. He is a community health worker at Healthcare for the Homeless in Houston. And today he will be telling us more about all the voter registration work he's done over the years in Houston and share tips for success and talk about working with consumer advisory boards and consumers. We are also joined by Caitlin Donnelly. Caitlin is the Education Engagement Coordinator at Nonprofit Vote. As the organization's name implies, Nonprofit Vote works with nonprofits such as ours to help organizations register the people they serve to vote. They are a huge wealth of knowledge and resources, and they have a ton of information on how to integrate voter registration, and we're really glad to have Caitlin here today talking more about that. So there are 3 objectives that we hope everyone in this webinar will leave with today and take with them. We hope that you will know ways that you can participate in voter registration. We hope that you will gain an understanding of the legal and logistical limitations of doing voter registration, and we also hope that you will have and locate resources that will help you with this. And I think all of you, if you are able to open that PDF in the resource slide, have already done number 3, so we are off to a great start. All right, so before I pass it over to Caitlin to talk, I am just going to set the stage doing a very quick historical background to get us into the right mindset. As a quick civics refresher, our country was founded just about 230 years ago, and at that time it was mostly white, land-owning, and wealthy men who were voting. A few years after the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution was ratified, as we all know, in 1788, and the Constitution gave the states the power to run federal elections. It didn't give any person or any group any right to vote. It simply just wrote out in the Constitution that states have the power to run their elections, and that is still very much a power that states have to this day. So over the next 200 years since the Constitution has been amended and adjusted to write out the right for certain groups and populations to vote. There were a lot of amendments to the Constitution that involve voting in the election process. The ones you have up on the screen in front of you is certainly not a comprehensive list. It's just to give you a sense of the timeline. And it's also important to note that in 1870, the 15th Amendment wrote out the right of African Americans to vote, but we know that when we look at this in a historical context, it wasn't until nearly 100 years later that African Americans really were exercising the right to vote. When the 15th Amendment passed, states continued to do things such as poll taxes or literacy tests and some other kind of odd and arbitrary measures that were specifically intended to keep African Americans from voting, and all that they did worked, and it kept people from voting. So nearly 100 years after this, the Voting Rights Act was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. It was signed in 1965, just a few months after this photo on the right of your screen was taken at the famous Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. And what the Voting Rights Act did is that it prohibited states from doing those discriminatory practices. And now, while the Voting Rights Act is far from perfect, it is, as most of us know on this webinar, it was a huge civil rights victory, and it really made an enormous difference on who and how people were able to vote and increased voter turnout. Now, in more recent times, we have the court case Shelby v. Holder in 2013. We're not really going to go into this because we don't have time today, but in short, I'll just say that this is a Supreme Court case that ended up overturning some of the restrictions the Voting Rights Act did, and it actually gave states back more power. In reaction to this, a few states amped up their restrictive practices right before the 2016 election. If you're passionate about this, if policy and advocacy around voting rights is something you care about, I recommend looking into this. There are a lot of groups currently doing work to get us back on track after Shelby v. Holder, and I can put you in touch with that. But today, moving on, we will say, is voting a right that everyone can exercise? Certainly not. There are still many practices being done in states to make it more difficult, as you can see on this slide. And again, all of these are going to differ state by state. But if you're convicted of a felony or have a criminal record, sometimes you are required to bring photo IDs, different forms of ID to vote. You might be required to prove citizenship. So certain states may reduce or change or adjust early voting or absentee days. There are some misinformation campaigns. In a lot of states, it's not really clear what the rules are, particularly around if you can vote with a felony, and this lack of proper information keeps a lot of people from voting because they might just assume that they can't if they have a felony and not go forward. And then, of course, we also all know that you can't vote in U.S. territories. So many of these provisions that differ by state are just akin to the poll taxes and literacy tests that we had about 100 years ago, and they are mostly keeping people of color, vulnerable populations, and low-income people from voting. So this is where we are today. All right, if you're on this webinar here with me today, you are the choir and I am the preacher, and I know I don't really need to spend too much time talking about why this is important, but just to go over a few of these points, I will say that doing voter registration and engagement is extremely important. It is a part of our mission. The Health Center program was founded during the Civil Rights Movement right around 1965 when the Voter Rights Act was passed, and the intent of the Health Center program, of which Healthcare for the Homeless is a part of, was to seek justice and rights for everybody, particularly vulnerable populations. And that mission and that founding principle extends far beyond just health care and even housing, and includes all human rights and voter rights. So this is a part of our work and our mission. It's also important because it's empowering. It's empowering for staff and volunteers in our agencies to engage in this system in this way. But the act of voting itself is also powerful and empowering for those who are doing it. It's participating in a system, being a part of that system, having autonomy over a decision and a choice that will impact your future. It's something extremely important and meaningful, and it's something we should all want our clients, our consumers, and everyone in our community to be experiencing. And of course, it's important for policy reasons. Who we are electing, who we're voting for, they are deciding the future of Medicaid. They are deciding the future of Section 8 vouchers. They are deciding the future of countless other systems and structures that will stand to either perpetuate poverty and keep it going, or get us closer to ending it. The bottom line is that we cannot and we will not end homelessness if we are not voting people in to make the right decisions here. And the way we do that is by letting everyone who is impacted by these decisions vote. And last but not least, people experiencing homelessness are largely underrepresented. This is not a surprise to any of you. As organizations, as individuals invested in civil and human rights, we must be working to undo this wrongdoing. So all that said, I will say this is completely legal. It's even encouraged for us working with underrepresented populations to be doing this work. So with that, I will pass it over to Caitlin to talk more. On to you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Regina, and thank you to everyone who joined us on this webinar today. I am so happy to be talking with Healthcare for the Homeless community about voter registration and engagement. So a little bit about Nonprofit Vote. As Regina said, we are sort of a resource center for nonprofits who are looking to begin or deepen their voter engagement strategies. Our mission and our vision is that sometime in the future, hopefully a future that's not too far off, every nonprofit organization, every 501c3 incorporates voter engagement as a regular practice, that it's not seen as controversial, but that it is just as American as apple pie, and that it's something that we all do. So I will do just a tiny bit more preaching to this choir about why voter registration. So nonprofits can really make the difference because of the reach that nonprofits have, particularly with communities that are overlooked by others, communities that have historically low voting rates. There are unique assets that nonprofits have, especially that ongoing interaction and the level of trust they build over time with the people that they serve and the community that they're in. And hopefully the staff at the nonprofit really reflect the community, and so there's a high level of cultural competency there. When I was first talking to Regina and Joseph about this presentation, Joseph really reminded me of all those barriers that people experiencing homelessness face that are different than many other populations. And so this community having a lot of a deeper understanding and more sensitivity to those challenges is going to be more effective at getting people who are experiencing homelessness to not only be registered, but actually turn out to vote. And lastly, as Regina said, completely legal, and this is in fact affirmed by the IRS. Nonprofits are encouraged to do nonpartisan voter education and to help get out the vote through voter registration drives, engaging with candidates, educating voters, etc. As long as they're being nonpartisan, it is totally acceptable. And before I move on, I want to share with you a statistic that goes back to a lot of what Regina was saying that really surprised me, that popped up in my inbox this morning. PRRI, which is the Public Religion Research Institute and does a lot of awesome nonpartisan research. They just put out the results of a poll, and they're specifically looking at Middle America, but they have a stat that looks at all Americans, where they ask, to the best of your knowledge, does your state allow residents to vote if they do not have a permanent address? 15% of Americans said, yes, my state does allow that. This is really concerning because, in fact, all 50 states allow folks that do not have permanent addresses, that are not do not currently have a home, they allow them to vote. 23% of Americans thought that you just couldn't vote at all if you didn't have a permanent address, and 60% weren't sure. So there's a lot of education and communication we need to do, both with people experiencing homelessness, but also the country at large, citizens at large, helping them to understand that, yes, you can vote even if you do not have a home. So I have up here a graphic we like to use about the positive feedback loop that nonprofits can create when they are intervening. Normally, folks who are experiencing homelessness, a lot of low-income folks from different racial and ethnic minorities, have a history of not voting, and when they don't vote, they're labeled as an unlikely voter, and that information goes to campaigns who target people who are more likely to vote. So if you haven't voted in the past, you're unlikely to get contact from campaigns, and no one is asking you to vote. But when nonprofits step in and engage, they can really change that all and set up a positive feedback loop. so that this is a self-perpetuating thing, that once you get someone into that habit of voting, they're more likely to develop that habit as an ongoing thing from year to year, election to election. So moving from the theory of the why you should do voter engagement and voter registration into the action. You need to know your stuff. Now, every one of the 50 states does allow people who are experiencing homelessness to register to vote, but a lot of other laws vary from state to state, such as eligibility for ex-offenders, what you can do for folks who have histories of domestic violence and maybe want to keep their contact information off of voter rolls as a form of protection and privacy, different things like deadlines for registration. So if you go to the Nonprofit Vote website, we have a voting in your state page that's very popular, and we have all this information listed right there. It's important that the staff that are working on the registration efforts really understand these rules as well, and that they also understand how to remain nonpartisan. I'm sure most of you all know this, but it doesn't hurt to say it again. Remaining nonpartisan really just means that a nonprofit isn't implying support or a lack of support for any candidate or party. You're not trying to influence the way a person votes. You're just trying to get them to understand the importance of voting and hopefully make that choice to actually go out to the polls, and giving them an education in sort of their options for going to the polls. So making sure they know those deadlines for registration. Early voting periods are another awesome way to get people who have different circumstances involved in voting. Maybe that one day wasn't going to be a good day for them. Maybe there's an early voting period day that you can sort of get people together to go as a group. All different ways you can use early voting to your benefit. So you need to know when and where that is available, and also how you can secure absentee or mail-in ballots. Especially for states that have mail-in ballots, that could be a really good option, because then you take away the need to think about transportation and timing. So there are some best practices for success, and these are backed up by not just anecdotal evidence, but actually research that Nonprofit Vote has done in the field with service agencies in particular across many different states. So you want to get buy-in from both the staff and the leadership and ensure that they really understand the value and urgency behind voter registration. And it's not just a once-a-year thing. It can be part of your programming and your services year-round. You want to assign a point person to really coordinate the efforts and ensure those registration forms are turned in on time. The absolute last thing we want is for a registration form to end up in the back of someone's desk and a voter thinking that they're registered showing up on election day to find out that no, they are not registered. So having a point person who can track the efforts and make sure things are turned in a timely fashion, as written by your state regulations. Many states have deadlines for not only when a person needs to register, but a time period for how long somebody can actually hold on to that form if they're holding a registration drive before they turn it in. That point person can also help think through how this is going to get integrated into the existing activities. So hosting a voter registration drive event is great, but what we've realized is actually more effective is that you're situating voter registration into existing activities or events. So if you have someone doing intake, have them also ask folks, are you currently registered to vote? Is your registration up to date? Can I help you check your registration, etc.? You can integrate it into a class or a meeting. You could do a whole lesson on voting, and we really recommend that that's part of your efforts, because a lot of people may not vote because they don't understand what that process is going to be, so it feels very intimidating. So if you can walk them through, these are the races and the names that are going to be on your ballot. This is the form of ID that you need to bring to the polls, the polling place, hold a mock election. These are all ways you can get people more comfortable with the voting process. And you can also do registration during other planned events. So whether you are hosting an event or co-sponsoring with other organizations that you partner with, see if you can set up a voter registration table. And especially if you're in a state that offers online voter registration, you want to think about what's going to work best for you and in your situation. So paper forms are great because you don't need any technology. You could have, 5, 10, 15 people all, signing the forms and completing those forms at once. Whereas with online voter registration, you need to make sure you have devices and a strong Wi-Fi connection. But we do know that online has a better rate of completion and fewer errors. So think about what's going to work best for you and your circumstances and plan around it. So moving beyond registration, and I've touched on some of these things already, you want to educate voters on what it will really be like to vote. Educate them on what is on the ballot. Again, not telling people who to vote for, but making sure they understand the races in the election. I think it's particularly powerful if you can highlight maybe recent pieces of legislation or things that are sort of up for discussion right now, and talk about how the person who's elected to that office can affect that decision. You don't need to go into, well, this person would vote that way and this person would vote this way, but making sure people understand the importance and the real-world implications, and they can connect it back to their lives. Supplying a sample ballot, if you can get one from your local League of Women Voters or even your local election board, is also a great way to help people understand who and what they're voting for. And then getting out the vote on Election Day and during early voting periods. So providing rides to the polls, helping people get the ID they need to vote, and helping them really make a plan for how they're going to vote. People experiencing homelessness, I know as, years ago I did work with homelessness population in central Georgia. You really need to plan out, what is your day going to look like? Where do you need to be today? It takes a lot of planning and thinking ahead to make sure you have what you need, and voting is the same for all voters, really, not even just those experiencing homelessness. I think this may be my last slide, but one last thing I want to lift up is National Voter Registration Day. So September 25th, 2018 will be National Voter Registration Day, and if you have not heard of it before, it is a celebration and day of action regarding democracy and ensuring that all eligible Americans are registered to vote. It's a nonpartisan holiday endorsed by the National Association of Secretaries of State and several big nonprofit organizations, associations, and many big media companies as well, including Facebook, Twitter, BET, etc. So we bring all these partners together each year, and since 2012 we've registered 1.6 million voters on National Voter Registration Day. And on that resource page that Regina provided, there is a link to sign up as a partner. So I invite all of you to get your health center or the nonprofit that you work with to partner on National Voter Registration Day. It's a great baby step or first foray into the voter registration world. Since it's concrete, it's just one day. And by signing up, we'll be able to provide you with posters to promote the event, stickers to pass out, and lots of resources online on how you can plan your event and make it really successful. So unless I was mistaken and I have another slide, I think it is time to turn it back to you, Regina.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. And yes, it is time to turn it back to me. So I'm just going to quickly build upon what Caitlin was speaking about. Some of this will be a little bit of a reiteration, but I'm going to talk a little more specifically about how to integrate and really do voter registration in the healthcare for the homeless setting. So options for integrating. What we really want to communicate on this webinar and to you today that this does not need to be intimidating. This does not need to be complicated. This can be simple, and this can hopefully be easily built into your system. I know it can seem intimidating, but really it can be just as simple as having materials in your lobby, of printing out forms and having them in your lobby. We also recommend doing this and making this a part of the intake process. You can include a checkbox on intake forms, for example. If you're not registered, would you like to register today, with a checkbox? You can assign a staff member to train intake people working at the intake desk to help people fill out those forms, have those forms available. And truly this can be as complicated or put as much effort into making it a part of your intake process. You can just have a couple forms in your lobby and you can print out a Word document that says if you're interested in registering to vote, fill out this form and turn it at the front desk. Additionally, you can do bigger efforts that Caitlin mentioned, holding voter registration drives. Joseph will talk a little bit later about the big voter registration efforts he's done. These targeted voter registration events will include more staff and volunteer time, and like any event would ideally have time and resources available for marketing and notifying clients leading up to the drive. And then two important things for us in the healthcare for the homeless community that we really want to emphasize here is the importance and benefit of engaging and utilizing your consumer advisory board, your CAB, and other consumer-led groups here. Having consumers take the lead on voter registration can relieve a lot of pressure from staff, and of course it's important to provide them with backup and support and keep support going there. And then of course community partners. No HCH is an island. There are plenty of organizations doing this type of work, registering people to vote. Sometimes incorporating voter registration into your practice could be as easy as just reaching out to someone and asking them if they're doing a voter registration drive. If maybe you could organize driving some clients over there, maybe you can have some of their volunteers come to your lobby. So when registering people experiencing homelessness to vote, there are a few common barriers that come up. And overcoming these barriers is mostly just done by having an understanding of your state and local laws so you can help the clients navigate these whatever hoops that they need to jump through. No time is a big barrier that might come up. This is pretty simple. It's just about being honest, about knowing about absentee voting and providing that information to them. If it's just voter registration, it's being frank with them on how much time this will take and being clear that this is just a quick first step. Another one is no ID. Again, this is really about knowing the laws in your state of what's required and knowing what does count as an acceptable form of ID. And then beyond that, if you know a certain form of ID is required, it's having information available and on hand so that you can then help that client get that ID or guide them to someplace where they can do that if they don't have that ID. No home. We have said this a few times now, but the courts have ruled repeatedly that you don't need a home to vote. Overcoming this barrier is really about having an address for them that they can use. Voter registration forms typically require an address. A lot of times local shelters or parks or public agencies will allow you to use their address, but even better, see if you can use your agency's address for them and have that on hand and available so when they're filling out the forms they can easily look over and have an address to copy down. And criminal record, just the same. It's about really knowing the details in your state and having that available to present to them clearly. And so here are the four main things that you'll really want to check the local laws and requirements for. You can find this out off of our research page. Caitlin guided you to resources on this. Be sure you have a mailing address on hand. Make sure you know the laws about an ID or where you can get an ID or go seek that ID if you need it. Know citizenship and citizenship paperwork requirements, and then, of course, the criminal background requirements in your state. All right, so do's and don'ts. There are a few do's just to get us back on track here. This is about assisting people with forms, about educating clients about the voting process. It is about offering HCH as a resource of information to be used as a mailing address, discussing the importance of engaging in this process. It's about finding staff and volunteer time to help mail in forms and to be informed about your state laws. What this is not about is refusing anybody an opportunity. It's not about questioning anybody about personal details. It's not about attaching any information on your agency's agenda or discussing candidates or having an opinion on candidates or endorsing any of those candidates or political parties. That is what this isn't. So other election activities. If you are just looking into this and starting and want to start doing election activities, I encourage you to look at this slide as kind of a wish list and up next. If you're already doing voter registration of some form, I encourage you to look at this slide and think, what more can I do? What can I do that's on this slide that I'm not doing? Leading up to the election, there's a lot that can be done to make our consumers and our clients more comfortable and prepared and ready to go when it comes to voting. You can find out information and dates and times and location about early voting, about absentee ballots. You can print out maps and addresses of polling locations, and then a sample ballot is a great way to do some education there, to have a sample ballot on hand to go through that. And then nonpartisan, non-candidate-based issue education is something you can also do leading up. And then on election day, a big barrier is really getting to the polls, and putting that vote in is what that's all about, right? So anything you can do to help transport our clients to the polling area, or even being there and having a presence at the polling location, voting and showing up and getting there can be a really kind of intimidating and scary process. And I think even just having someone there, having a volunteer, having a familiar face to take you to the polling location or be at the polling location makes this a lot easier. Okay, and I accidentally switched the slide on behalf of Joseph, but Joseph, I will go ahead and turn it over to you to talk more about your work in Houston.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Regina. My name is Joseph Benson. I'm a community health worker with Healthcare for the Homeless Houston. I'm also a consumer, which means that I once was formerly homeless. And to give you a little history about how I got involved with voter registration was that when I went to my first conference, I was given a mentor, a consumer mentor, and on that particular day she had a dinner engagement, and she put me at this table in between two gentlemen. One was named Paul Boulder from San Francisco, who is the CEO and founder of RAP, and the other person was Randall Loeb out of Denver, Colorado. And they were talking about voter registration, and you could vote without having a home. And as they was going back and forth with each other, they was dropping information in front of me. That kind of set a fire under me. So when I got back to Houston, I went to my CEO and told her what I had found out at the conference. And she looked at me and said, okay, well, that's great, Joseph. Who is going to spearhead and run the voter registration drive? And I volunteered. So by being a member of our Consumer Advisory Board here in Houston, one of the things that always came up was we needed something to do. And voter registration drive was the perfect thing to get consumers involved. So one of the rules of being on the Consumer Advisory Board here in Houston is that you have to go to the tax assessor's office and take the course to become a voter registrar. By having those individuals becoming a deputy voter registrar, it allowed us to be able to set a table up every Monday in our resource center and do voter registration. The thing that helped here in Houston and that drove people to come to get registered was that in Texas, having a voter registration card is the second form of identification. So that helped a lot. And then when they would have health fairs, we were able to set up tables at the different health fairs. We were able to use Homeless Memorial Day, which is December the 21st, and set up tables when they would have the different events going on for Homeless Memorial Day. Like what Colin was saying earlier, we would take and use Voter Registration Day as a forum to set up to do voter registration drives. We also, in August, you have Healthcare Day. And on August the 16th, we would use that to set up to do voter registration drives. And recently, we've been trying to start a Homeless Success Day, and which is June the 21st. And we would use that to do voter registration also. What was able to happen that we found once we started doing the voter registration drives, even though we had people that would register, they felt uncomfortable going to the poll that we use here in Houston because we're downtown. And that particular poll is set up in River Oaks, which is an exclusive area of Houston. And the thing that would turn people off was that it would be so many police at that particular location, they felt that when they look at your driver's license, your identification, or they look at your voter registration, they will put it in the computer to see if you had any warrants out. So my community, which is a homeless community, felt uncomfortable. I had to find a way in order to be able to get them to go to the polls. The two things that I used was being able to mail in your ballot and early voting. They have another area of town which is called Third Ward, and they have polling stations over there, and it wasn't really that far away from where our location is. So we influenced people to go to early voting, and they was accepted over at that particular polling station, and it was easier for them to be able to do that. Earlier they was talking about one of the barriers about being able to vote was how to get there. We were fortunate enough here in Houston that during early voting and on voting day, taxis, the bus, and the train system, if you show them your voter registration card and let them know that you're going to go vote, they will get you to the polling station, and they would also bring you back from the polling stations. One of the other things that we did in order to try to get people to the polling station was we offered lunches for those individuals that would go to the polling station, and when they come back with the badge from the polling station to say, I voted. And so that worked. So it's been now about 13 years that we've been doing the voter registration, and I'm proud to say that over these 13 years we have registered approximately 3,500 people to be registered so they can vote. One of the things that the other thing that comes up is having to be able to educate the community to let them know how important it is to vote. Because a lot of people feel that voting at midterms or voting in local elections really don't have a direct impact on them. And what we try to get them to see is that, especially in the city election, that's something that's going to have an immediate, direct impact on those individuals. And the midterm election has an impact because that's when they vote for the senators and the congresspersons, and they also vote for the legislators that's in their state. So we try to get that information out to them as often as we can. One of the things, the other thing is that amongst the homeless community, you have people that are felons. Here in Texas, when people leave the penal system, one of the things that they're told is that they cannot vote, which is not true in the state of Texas. The law says in the state of Texas that once you finish probation or parole, you then are eligible to vote. So one of the things that we stress is that no matter what state you're in, take and find out what that the laws in that particular area is so that you can give people the right information. And once you become a deputy registrar, you have to remember that you have to be nonpartisan. You cannot tell an individual to vote either Democratic or Republican or vote for a particular person. Only thing you're doing is just registering that individual so they can vote. Thank you, and I will turn it back over to Regina.
All right. Thank you so much, Joseph. Thank you for telling us about your experience. A lot of good insight there. All right. So we're about to go over and start doing questions. I see we got a few questions in to answer. This is just a copy of the resource guide. I think all three of us have said that it's really important that you look up the laws and restrictions in your specific state. Here are all the links and resources to do that. You can also download this under the resource tab. And if you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to reach out, or if there's something you feel is not on this list, reach out and we'll dig that up for you. All right, so now it looks like we have 2 or 3 questions, and we're going to go through them. So the first question I have is, what about voting for specific policies or referendums? Can nonprofits encourage participants to vote yes on a measure that looks at affordable housing, for example? So I'll just quickly say that nonprofits can do work on ballot measures and specific policies, and there are rules and restrictions on how you can do work there, but that would legally be considered lobbying, and nonprofits are allowed to do lobbying in general. Of course, there are certain restrictions, and you should always check with your agency before going on and doing that. But I'm going to kind of push this question off to Caitlin, because Caitlin, we know that nonprofits can legally do lobbying with limitations, but how would this work with voter registration? So Caitlin, on to you.
Sure. So yes, you can absolutely, while you're doing voter registration, talk to people about a ballot measure and express a position on that ballot measure. What you cannot do is refuse to register someone on the basis of them not wanting to vote in favor or in opposition to the ballot measure. You can't do that in general regarding their, the party they'll affiliate with, or any of their political values. You're really not supposed to deny registration to anyone who is interested and eligible. So I would say yes, you can do it. If you are going to do any sort of ballot measure advocacy, I would refer you to Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy campaign, because they can tell you a lot more about the subtle intricacies and legal pieces of doing ballot measure lobbying. But I will say that I don't counsel nonprofits to stay away from that, because it actually can encourage people to vote, even if people feel really pessimistic about their choices for candidates in a race. Maybe, they just already know the candidate they want is highly unlikely to be elected. Engaging them around ballot measures can give them a lot more hope and incentive to actually participate in voting.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. And we're trying to we have a link for that Boulder Advocacy, so we're going to try to get that to you here on this webinar chat shortly. So keep an eye out for that, or if not, we'll figure out a way to email that out. So thank you for that question. Okay, so another question I have, and I'm going to put this one to Joseph. This is that I'm hosting a Project Homeless Connect event in September. How can I get a voter registration table there, and who should I contact? So I'll just first say that specifically to this person that we can be in touch with you privately to talk about specifics. And I'll pass this over to Joseph and say, Joseph, can you speak more generally to this question? If you're just getting started, you're having an event and you want a voter registration, what do you recommend for getting started to just get a table there?
I would suggest to reach out to the League of Women Voters because they are great advocates for voter registration. They can also bring out the machine that you all use in your area for voting, and that would get people used to using that particular machine, and they would be happy to come out and set up a table. That's the easiest way to go. Or if you have consumers that you're working with, I would suggest that have them go to downtown to your tax assessor's office and become deputy registrars. That way you would always have those individuals on hand to set up a table whenever you get ready. Because the course is only about an hour long. And the only thing you have to have is your identification. You go and watch the film, fill out the forms, and they will give you the necessary voter registration forms and everything. They will give you the dates to let you know when all the forms need to be turned in so you can have everyone registered.
Okay, great. That's a good tip. And I see here underneath the presentation slide, there is a box for links, and the first link is that Boulder Advocacy that covers the first question about ballot measures and advocacy there, and then the second is a link to the League of Women Voters. And the person that asked that question, thank you. We can be in touch with you, and we can talk more specifically and help you make that happen. Thank you so much for your advocacy, and thank you so much for trying to get a voter registration table there. All right, so I have a question. I'm going to give this one to Caitlin. I'm going to say, how can organizations interact with candidates at candidate forums? Can we provide information about their stance on issues? So I assume this means about the candidate's stance on an issue. Can we ask them questions or ask them to make statements on issues? In general, what ways can we or can we not interact with candidates? So Caitlin, I know that's a long one, but over to you.
You know, this is a great topic, and I am actually leading a webinar on this very topic tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. So I just sent the link over to the presenters, and maybe they can add the registration link to that link queue. You can definitely engage with candidates. You need to do so in a way that doesn't project no one's ever going to have this thinking that your organization is in support of or opposition to a candidate. Obviously, as individuals, we all have our own personal thoughts and values, and as organizations, it might be rather clear that we're aligned with one party or one candidate over another, but as long as you're not putting out that preference towards voters. So, for instance, you can use a candidate questionnaire that all candidates are able to answer questions, that those questions don't sort of imply a correct answer. They're open-ended, and you can publicize those answers to the community. But you can't rate or rank candidates. So comparing is fine, saying, you know, candidate A believes in this and said that they would vote for this initiative. Candidate B said they would vote against it. As long as you're not editorializing or putting in your opinion, comparing candidates and talking about them in just a factual, opinion-free way is totally fine and can be really helpful. So you can share nonpartisan resources developed by other groups with your audiences. So you'll know it's nonpartisan if it's from, ideally, another 501c3. They should be doing nonpartisan work, or another reputable nonpartisan source. Maybe your local newspaper has put out a guide. It's not their endorsement editorial, but it's just these are how all these different candidates fall on certain issues. And I will say you can share information with candidates about your the policies you work on, the issues you care about, as long as you're sharing it with all the candidates. Anything that you do for one candidate and not the others is going to imply support or, in some instances, opposition. So treating them all equally is really key to talking about and informing people about candidates in a nonpartisan manner.
Thanks. That's fabulous, Caitlin. And Joseph, I know Caitlin covered a lot of bases, but do you have anything to add on how you have educated? Oh, sure, go ahead.
Well, one of the things, and it's in one of the resources, the Coalition for the Homeless have a voter registration manual. And in the voter registration manual, it has a sample phone script to call candidates to be invited to a particular, to your form. They also have a sample invitation letter that you can use. Then they have a sample media advisory letter, and they also have sample news release letters that you can use also. And that's on page 75 through 79 in the voter registration manual that's on the website with the Coalition for the Homeless.
Great, thanks so much. And we have just linked in the link box to the voter registration manual, and most of these links too are also on that resource guide. Okay, so I have one other question for us so far. If you have any questions, we still have a few more minutes, so please put them in the box. But a question we have now, and I will ask this to Caitlin to start. It's another legal issue. The question is, what about citizenship? If someone is not sure if they are a citizen, how do we go about determining citizenship? And Caitlin, I'll expand this too, because as it's being answered, I'm wondering if people might also not be exactly sure about what their criminal history is, and other questions. Is there a way to look into this, and how do we go about this?
Sure. So citizenship in particular is really sensitive, especially right now. There's a lot of attention being paid to undocumented immigrants, and also a lot of attention on, voter fraud and this perception that people who are not citizens are voting. To date, there hasn't been any authentic, credible research showing that non-citizens are going out there and registering and voting and committing voter fraud. But we all, as a community of people who want to lift up particularly marginalized voters, need to be really sensitive about that. I would say the first thing I'd ask is if they know if they have a social security number, or if they know they were born in the United States. If they were born in the United States, they are a citizen. If they have a social security number, they are either a citizen or they are authorized to work in the United States, and they probably, if they've gone through some sort of work authorization process, I think they should be sort of somewhat aware of that process happening, and you can explain to them, the difference between being authorized to work in the United States and being a naturalized citizen. The League of Women Voters might be, again, another good resource. That's a really tricky question. That is really hard, and I think it comes down to a case-by-case basis. And I certainly do not want to recommend to anyone to just try registering someone, especially if you're in a state where you know that there's an ICE presence and that somebody could get picked up if they are in fact not a citizen and are not in the country legally. For folks who have other circumstances that make them think they're ineligible, I think that's a great reason to actually have a good relationship with your local election board. I encourage that because that way, when you're doing registration, if something comes up and you already have an established relationship, you can go to your local election board with questions or concerns. If the first time they hear from you is, hey, we are doing registration, we don't know if this person who is an ex-offender can register or not, you might not get as warm a reception. So I would say before you even start, make a contact, let them know that you're going to be doing this work, give them the name of that point person, maybe share with them, like, oh, we're planning on doing this, we're going to be at this event doing this, just so you know. But the local election board can be really helpful in terms of helping you understand who's eligible, especially when you get to situations that aren't very clear and you can't just look up the answer on your Secretary of State website.
Thanks, Caitlin. Good tips. All right, so we got another question in, and I think this one is perfect to end on. I'll throw it over for both Joseph and Caitlin for their perspective. So if your health center is hesitant to do voter registration because of a fear of being political, what talking points, what responses, what do you say to encourage people in support of voter registration? And so, Caitlin, I'll start with you.
Well, this is healthcare for the homeless, and voting has been shown to have positive health benefits. And I can't believe I neglected to think of this earlier. We actually have a whole community health vote website, and I'm going to shoot that link over. And we actually face this a lot in the health community. For healthcare centers, there is some hesitation around that perception of this being political work. But I would point them back to, the IRS guidelines actually affirmatively state that nonprofits can do this work of voter education. You can point to, trainings that are out there from Boulder Advocacy and from Nonprofit Vote, among other places, on how you remain nonpartisan, to demonstrate that you do have a really solid understanding of how to do this in a way that's not going to become political. And that's really what we're trying to do, is trying to convince people that this is something that we should all do as nonprofits. National Voter Registration Day, because it has such strong bipartisan support, we have a Republican and a Democratic Secretary of State that sits on the National Voter Registration Day Steering Committee. Point to that as maybe this is a first step for us to get involved in voter engagement and voter registration in a way that is just completely apolitical, completely nonpartisan. It's all about registering people and not at all about trying to get people to vote in any one way.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. That's a great closing words, a great link for people to go to. And then, Joseph, I'll turn it over to you. Final words on encouraging people to do voter registration.
Well, like I say, it's always good to get the consumers that you have as your consumer advisory board to become deputy registrars. That way they can not only have the registrations at the projects where the health centers are, but they can do registrations out in the community. They can go door to door, or if they're affiliated with a particular church, synagogue, or mosque, they can do voter registrations at their religious places. You can make connections with the League of Women Voters, because they always need volunteers to help them do voter registration. Go to the Urban League. The Urban League is always pushing voter registration also. Those are things that you can get your consumers involved in.
Great, that's fabulous, and thanks for emphasizing the importance of consumer involvement in all steps of the process here. All right, folks, so we are right at the hour. I will leave you with this quote from John Lewis: "The vote is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have." Thank you so much for being here. Please reach out with questions. Please reach out and let us know the activities you're doing. We love to hear about it. Shortly after this webinar screen closes, there will be a very quick survey, and then, of course, the webinar recording will be emailed to you and up on our website within 3 business days. Thank you so much, and with that,